Mia Bonta, trustee, City of Alameda Unified School District, and Janani Ramachandran. Thank you so much for joining. You're doing amazing work in justice law, so truly appreciate your participation. Thank you. So first question. The current Global Warming Solution Act requires a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. What more will you do to protect our climate and people? So please, you have 2 minutes each to respond. Trustee Bonta?
Thank you. I think first and foremost, we need to recognize that we need to fully decarbonize our economy and do so with the kind of urgency that our climate and our children and our families deserve. We need to make sure that we're investing in green energy production so that we have the energy that doesn't rely on fossil fuels. And a part of that is making sure that we're rebuilding and reinvesting in our transportation system so that we're taking away and living up to the promise that we've made and that the governor has made to remove fossil fuel vehicles from our state with urgency and promoting electric vehicles to be able to do that. And finally, we need to ensure that our housing production, our housing plan is focused around transit-oriented hubs so that we don't have to have people displaced and living so far away from their home and having to travel from home to work, which just kills our ability to have clean air and a clean environment. And then we need to make sure that all of this comes down to things that we can actually depend on, making sure that we're focused on power production in the kind of legislation that we pass, ensuring that we're supporting things like David Chu's bill that brings in green energy, like our windmills, and create a lot more projects that ensure that we have a just transition to be able to support our economy and our workers while we're saving our planet. And we need to ensure that we're removing all of the ways in which we are not being environmentally just. A lot of what Oakland faces is dealing with the heavy trucking and transit that passes through our ports and the coal that passes through our ports. And we need to make sure that we're removing fracking as something that we're doing in this country. We don't need to ensure that we're doing that. And in the state, because fracking is now impacting low-income communities more than others. So I think those are the bold plans that we need to ensure that we keep our planet safe while ensuring that we're protecting our working families and our families across the board.
Janani Ramachandran.
So I would prioritize enacting a Green New Deal, a series of legislation that would comprise a Green New Deal, not 20 years from now, but starting now. We need solutions, not just investments. We need plans that prioritize communities most impacted by extractive industries. So I will fight to immediately start a just transition for jobs in extractive industries, work across a broad coalition of stakeholders to make sure that this can be a reality in the way that it has already shown it can be done with our most recent offshore wind bills becoming a success and Biden's infrastructure dollars pouring into that to make sure it's a success. I would ensure that people have a jobs guarantee so people who want to work in green technology are able to, and we can create hundreds of thousands of well-paying jobs in these sectors. I would support bills along the lines of SB 467 to create much needed buffer zone against oil and gas extraction and fight to combat other fossil fuel industries as well, including the transportation of coal, bolstering the efforts of local organizations like No Coal in Oakland, and supporting legislation to deal with the extremely toxic damage of abandoned oil wells as well. I will ensure that a new Green New Deal incorporates utility accountability and justice for investor-owned utilities like PG&E that have been held criminally negligent yet continue to support financially our lawmakers. And I would support bills along the lines of SB 262 to make sure that large corporate polluters are held accountable. I'm dismayed that this turned into a 2-year bill. I'm dismayed that we had AB 995 and other attempts to hold toxic polluters accountable vetoed year after year. And I would continue to fight for the electrification of transportation, expanding CCAs, supporting resiliency hubs, and protecting public lands and preserving them.
To who? So, question 2. 2 important issues in California's climate programs are equity in incentive programs benefiting low-income Californians, and 2, environmental justice for fence line communities near toxic industry that offset their carbon emissions elsewhere. How will you work to ensure equity and environmental justice in California climate policy?
I had the privilege many years ago of working with residents who lived in the Iron Triangle, who sat experiencing issues related to asthma, higher incidence of asthma, higher incidence of eczema and skin-related diseases and concerns, and higher incidence of cancer. We see those kinds of things still existing in our city in Oakland and in parts of this entire district. I think the primary thing that we need to focus on when we're talking about environmental justice is to actually focus on the people who are most impacted by this. Our voices are hard to be heard, and because of the need for greater diversity in climate action and climate change, we need to make sure that we're proactively reaching out to the people who are most impacted. So what would I do as a state legislator? I would use the power of convening, the power of the bully pulpit to make sure that those voices get heard by making sure that the advocacy organizations, the people, the residents who are most impacted have the ability to be heard. And that means taking our ears as a state legislator and taking the entirety of our body to the people to be heard for what they need. I think as we think about environmental justice, we really need to be able to recognize that race and ethnicity matter, as they always do. And it's no surprise that the people who are most devastated by climate action are people who are experiencing poverty, people who are Black and brown in our community. And we need to make sure that we're centering those voices by investing in the infrastructure that would allow those voices to be heard. That means that we're not divesting ourselves of the community-based organizations, the nonprofit organizations who have a right and an ability to be first line, front line in making sure that those practices and the impacts are heard and felt and translate into the kind of policies that we need to support our community.
Thank you. And Ms. Ramachandran?
When I worked at a community health clinic as a home visiting case manager, I saw that maternal mortality rates were 4 times higher for Black women. And this doesn't have to do with prenatal care. This has to do with social determinants of health. The women that I was working with were breathing some of the most toxic air. And so in order to deal with thinking about climate justice holistically, we need to think about all aspects of the problem. And in Oakland, a Black child in West Oakland and in parts of deep Oakland are 5 times more likely to suffer asthma than their white counterparts because of the ability of heavy polluting industries to carry on with what they do without real consequence. And these are unsurprisingly the zip codes with some of the highest rates of COVID. So it's not enough to pay lip service to environmental justice and roll-off statistics, but we need to focus on implementation, solutions rather than investments. And there's no better example than AB 617, where there was plenty of money invested and the goal was to focus on EJ communities, but it's not been working. We are stuck in not having the EJ communities actually served. We need to focus on making sure that the communities that are first to get zero emission buses are the ones most impacted by by decades of environmental racism. We need to not only support CCIs and incentives to support having more EVs on the road, but we need to make sure that people who can't afford these vehicles, even with the rebates, have access to emission-free, high-speed transit. So in order to think holistically about environmental justice, we need to think about healthcare, transportation, and implementation of the bills that we already have.
Thank you so much. We can dig a little bit deeper in question 3. You also get 2 minutes each. So the next question is, what should be done to address unhealthy air and toxics affecting communities that have been marginalized, like West Oakland and East Oakland. How will you ensure adequate funding is secured for remediation and clean up of contaminated lands, especially for homes, schools, and community parks and gardens?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, communities most impacted by decades of environmental racism, including right here in West Oakland and parts of East Oakland, are the more likely to suffer lower life expectancies, 5 times in particular to experience rates of asthma. And an individual in West Oakland breathes 5 times more nitrogen dioxide than anywhere else in the Bay Area. So we need to start holding corporate polluters accountable, including the ones in this district, including the AB&I Foundry and Schnitzer Steel. We need to make sure that these polluters are releasing data about their emissions along the lines of SB 260, which has unfortunately been converted into that 2-year bill. We need to expand CCAs. It's unfair that low-income communities can't afford to pay higher tiers for renewable energy because it costs more. We need to therefore think more broadly about a publicly owned grid rather than an investor-owned utility that's been held criminally negligent, criminally reckless for endangering lives, and using extremely unclear sources of energy. We need to expand environmental justice for communities on the fence line and make sure that they are prioritized. But in the meantime, before we drastically start cutting emissions, we need to make sure, which we will immediately with the Green New Deal passed, not 20 years from now, but starting to be passed next year, we need resiliency hubs, we need cooling centers, we need places to disseminate supplies. David Chu's bill that was initially intended to create a pilot program for these resiliency hubs was also converted into a 2-year bill. So the root cause of a lot of the issues about why these bills are continuously converted into 2-year bills and 5-year bills and ultimately kicked off at the table is because 70% of our lawmakers accept oil and gas corporate money, and we need to start electing officials that are going to care about environmental justice truly and not just pay lip service and continue to take these critical life-saving bills off the table in our state legislature.
Thank you so much.
I think one of the main toxic exposures that we need to focus on in this district in particular is the toxic exposure from lead paint that comes from our houses that are built before California's 1978 passage ban on lead paint, which has been heavily documented in parts of Oakland. I support making sure that we're increasing the testing for environmental contaminants and coordinate programming to either address the community cleanup that's needed or help individuals seek redress to be able to take the necessary steps that they need to remediate their residences. A lot of this is based in the ways in which we ensure that landlords are providing for these kinds of protections in our tenant protections. And we need to make sure that the community can surveil what is happening with stronger transparency in the actions of our landlords, in the actions of homeowners to be able to reduce those contaminants. We also need to make sure that we're addressing the air quality. We all woke up recently and saw the orange skies and breathed in the air that made us choke every single day. That's the experience every day when children and families have to deal with the dust that gets kicked up from the transport and rubber hitting our roads and creating because of the ways in which the transportation patterns work for delivery, where we have pollutants just coming into our lives every single day. And we do need to make sure that we're addressing wildfire. Wildfire is something that is causing us to have to recognize that we don't have the kinds of protections in place to be able to support our planet. And we need to ensure that we're putting more firefighters out there to reduce the to reduce the wildfires that we have in place. We need to make sure that we're building and planting more so that those wildfires are reduced, and we need to ensure that we have the ability to clear out the vegetation that's causing those wildfires as well.
Thank you so much. We are some messages are popping up. We are turning into question 4. Thank you so much for staying on time. What do you think about CEQA and its role in providing community members with the opportunity to be involved in addressing environmental impacts of government decisions? Do you support any efforts to limit CEQA's functions? And I have Ms. Ramachandran, please. Thank you.
I do not support efforts to undercut CEQA ever, as someone that has regularly commented in planning commission meetings, including in the planning commission meeting debating the Howard Terminal. I believe that this is a powerful setting to be able to express community voice. And this is the only forum that many individuals have to actually contact their legislators and local council members and local planning commissioners, absent other forums. I did not support bills, including SB 50, that tried to undermine some of these processes in the housing context, because CEQA is incredibly essential. And, we've given big corporations and developers constructing football stadiums and sports complexes a pass. We've given large developers a pass on these issues for far too long. But CEQA is designed to be intensive for a reason. There's, and I completely oppose the power of corporate dollars influencing legislation, particularly when it comes to housing development, to undercut these efforts to say, oh, it's just going to speed up the process. Well, we need to make sure that housing is built in an environmentally sustainable manner and not in wildfire zones, not in an area that's going to increase toxic pollution more than it needs to be, not in an area that threatens pedestrian safety, and not in an area that's going to lead to drastically increased levels of toxic pollutants. So I wholeheartedly do not support efforts to undermine CEQA in any type of construction.
Thank you so much.
I think that CEQA is a very critical process for our communities to be able to have as a stopgap to ensure that we are building and following, ensuring that we have the environmental protections that we need. I will say, frankly, that one of the challenges with CEQA and at 9,000 page reports is that they don't actually end up being accessible to the community in very real ways. So in addition to having those very reports, I think we must actually advance CEQA in ensuring that we have translated reports that allow for an everyday community member to be able to weigh in and not have to get a doctorate in environmental protection in order to be able to read through 9,000, 6,000 page reports. That's not access to the communities that are most impacted. So I'm in favor of ensuring that we preserve and maintain CEQA, wanting to make sure that we extend the accessibility of those reports so that they can have impact and be heard and understood and be given voice to by the communities who are most impacted.
Thank you so much. We are moving on to question number 5. Housing is often siloed as a single issue rather than connected with our environment. How do you see housing policy intersecting with climate policy? And what kind of solutions do the housing affordability and displacement crisis will you champion in the state legislature?
At the end of the day, you're absolutely right. The climate crisis is intertwined with our housing, transportation, the kind of density that we need in order to be able to support our environment, and the vehicle miles traveled. And those all relate to how we execute on housing. I want to make sure that we have traditionally single-family neighborhoods held to remove their exclusionary zoning ordinances that discourage growth and discriminate against people of color and people experiencing poverty in particular. I want to make sure that we have the ability to have housing built near transit hubs as a form of transit-oriented development to address the nexus between the climate crisis and transportation and those vehicle miles traveled. People should not be having to travel to Stockton in order to be able to put a paycheck on the table when they live in Oakland or vice versa, which is probably actually more the case because housing is unaffordable here in Oakland, in Alameda and San Leandro. And the cost of that is that we are not making sure that we have the ability to preserve our climate. So they are inextricably linked. I think we need to focus on making sure that we're not displacing our people, which ensures that we have that we need critical new housing developments, and that we stop the gentrification that is happening that requires us to do infilling and upzoning to promote housing production for sure. But we also need to ensure that our renters and our tenants have a voice in how that housing production happens, so that they are not also subject to the insecurity that comes with insecurity and instability that comes with being a renter. So I think those are the things that we need to focus on to ensure that we have a connected housing policy and strategy that is not subject to the whim and whimsy of any particular city. I think the housing that across the state, we need to ensure that that we have the ability to produce housing, produce affordable housing, most notably, and that we ensure that.
Thank you, Trustee. Thank you, Trustee Bonta.
As a tenants' rights attorney, I've watched some of our most vulnerable people be evicted during the pandemic. And when people are evicted, they're forced to live on the streets. They're forced to live in cars if they have them. They end up being unhoused, which are our communities that are the most vulnerable to our climate crisis, that bear the brunt of fire, wind, toxic pollution, heat waves. And we need to do everything possible to make sure people stay housed. I was personally inspired to run for this assembly seat because I saw our statewide eviction moratorium not doing enough for tenants during the pandemic. Hearing, watching, representing elderly tenants being evicted from their homes, survivors of violence, people who had children with disability be ripped away from their homes. So I want to incorporate environmental justice, not just as a siloed issue, not just checking the box and saying, I've done my Green New Deal bill for the year and that's good, but I want to make sure that I'm incorporating environmental considerations into every single bill, including and especially housing, rather than putting it into a box and keeping it a siloed issue. Yes, we need high density housing near transit, but not in the methods of the flawed SB 50 that provided absolutely nothing for low income communities, not even like the flawed SB 9 that doesn't similarly offer provision for low income and very low income communities. Because our problem in this district is not as much construction as it is construction of affordable units. We have thousands of vacant units, market rate units sitting empty in downtown Oakland right now, and in parts of West Oakland that are increasingly gentrified every day. But when also thinking about housing, we need to make sure that it's constructed near grocery stores, hospitals, health clinics, near resiliency hubs. We need to expand the ability of homes to obtain renewable energy and access solar.
Thank you so much. The next question is about transportation. What is your vision for future state and regional transportation funding? What projects, programs, and models of transportation should or should not be funded, and how should that funding be allocated and distributed?
I think transportation, particularly in this district, is one of the. Sorry, can you hear me?
We can hear you now. We couldn't hear you for a second there. Right. So we'll restart the time if that's okay. Do you want to continue?
Thank you. I think for us, one of the things that we need to consider, particularly in the 18th Assembly District, is that we are the home of the third largest port after LA and Long Beach. And so one of the things that we need to consider, and the projects that I would seek to support for this district, are to ensure that we have more electrification of our vehicles. And that's not just the individual consumer vehicles, but those also including production of electrified heavy duty vehicles, so that we can have our port operations be a part of the reduction of emissions and impact and reduce the impact of goods movements in our community. We also need to ensure that we have, even without diesel combustion, the vehicles themselves have environmental impacts, and we need to recognize that the wear and tear of these vehicles is impacting our ability and impacts our air quality as well. I'm in support of the governor's proposal, and actually think that we should be more aggressive on creating the electric vehicle infrastructure that will allow us to meet the goal of removing fossil fuel vehicles from our community by 2025, I believe it is, and that we need to build out the infrastructure to be able to support second and third generation vehicles, so that they can be something that every person and every consumer can purchase, particularly for people who are low income. And in our low income communities, we can't create a disparity in the access to the vehicles that we all need to be able to use by making sure that we're not producing vehicles that people can afford, as we try to phase out plans to end our reliance on fossil fuel vehicles.
Thank you so much. Ms. Ramachandran, please.
We need a widely expanded transportation system so that the benefits that I got to enjoy of using public transportation, using AC transit to go absolutely anywhere that I needed to when I was at Cal, can be, those benefits can translate to everyone. I never took a Lyft or a Uber for 3 years of law school. I never owned a car for the 3 years of law school because I took AC transit and would need BART absolutely everywhere. And that's because it was free for me as a student. And the second my student ID expired, I questioned, everyone pays $225 or $250 for AC transit, and thinking about the inequities of that situation really opened my eyes to understanding how we need better access. But that's the thing. I was able to go from my home in downtown Oakland to my job in another part of Oakland to law school all the way up in Berkeley because I always lived in privileged enough communities where there was a bus stop no more than 5 to 10 minutes away of a walk from my house. Yet my clients who I represented in court experiencing eviction in Deep East Oakland had to take 3 buses just to get to the courthouse. That is not access, and certainly had to spend a significant amount of money every single time. Had to expend funds, resources, and times even getting to a legal aid office to talk to someone about the fact that they're being evicted. So we need expanded transportation, expanded subsidies for individuals who can't afford an extremely high cost of fees. We need more bus lanes because the number of accidents I've been on AC transit buses on a near weekly basis is terrifying. We need high-speed transit. CCIs leading to rebates for EVs for privileged communities is one thing, but do nothing to those who don't have those privileges. We need emission-free buses. We need a cross-bay bridge to slow down emissions that are being stimulated every single day on the Bay Bridge. We need a cross-bay bus on the bridge and transportation systems that go back and forth. And we need affordable housing units near all transportation.
So closing statements, 60 seconds each candidate. And we are starting with Ms. Ramachandran, please. Thank you.
I'm running for state assembly because we don't need just another Democrat bought by corporate interests, bought by PG&E, bought by oil and gas interests. We need a climate change